Deputy Senator Patrick. Senator Rice.
Thanks, Acting Deputy President. There's no way that Australia should be signing this. Absolutely no way. I was a member of the Joint Standing Committee on Treaties when we had the hearings on this, and it was pretty clear that signing Rcep basically achieves nothing for us in terms of trade. There is no— number one, they won't actually release any independent modelling that shows the details, but basically on the evidence presented to us, there were no claims that it was going to have a massive improvement in our trade. Actually, there was no modelling that was presented to say, yep, this is going to be really good for Australia. It's basically things in terms of our relationships and trade relationships with the countries that were part of Rcep, it was all going to stay much the same. So, number one, the benefits, basically zero. Then you've got to look at the costs, and the costs of signing Rcep are immense, because basically it means that Australia is signing up to trade arrangements that are unfair, that are environmentally really damaging, and it's signing up to a trade agreement that has got no labour rights, it's got no human rights provisions. It basically is an incredibly old-fashioned, last-century way of doing trade that does not even stand up to the standards of most trade agreements that are now being negotiated around the world. I wanted to talk about four things that are fundamentally problems with Rcep and why Australia should be saying no and say, no, come on, yep, fair trade, good, we're happy to enter into trade agreements that are fair trade agreements, but Rcep is not that. The first was the total lack of transparency in the negotiations, in the whole process basically. The second is the lack of human rights standards. The third, the lack of labour rights standards. And fourthly, particularly in this last week that we're in this parliament before our Prime Minister goes off to Glasgow, before this immense time of the world coming together to be tackling our climate crisis, yet here we are signing up to a trade agreement that has got no environmental standards, that hasn't even got an environmental chapter, that basically says climate doesn't matter. So first of all, the lack of transparency in the negotiations, in the whole process. And I just think the easiest thing to summarise that is to read from the submission that AFTINET, the Australian Fair Trade and Investment Network, made to the inquiry into Rcep. And they basically said that Australia's current procedure for negotiating and ratifying trade agreements is highly secretive and is not compliant with the basic democratic principles that underpin our domestic policy-making processes. Trade negotiations are conducted in secret, and neither the Parliament nor the wider public had input into or oversight over the development of Australia's negotiation mandates. This was the case with the Rcep negotiations. Negotiation texts were secret throughout the negotiations, and the final text of the agreements was not made public until after the government made the decision to sign the agreement. That in itself is a reason why we should be saying no. We should be renegotiating our entire trade negotiation practices so they do not conflict with basic democratic engagement in these processes. And you can do it. Other countries in the world have got processes that actually allow for much more input of civil society, much more input of their parliaments before the agreements are signed. So it's not as if we'd be out on our own in insisting that this is the case. The second area, of course, as others have already noted in this debate, but interestingly on the behalf of the Labor Party, although they note this, it doesn't seem to influence how they vote, are the lack of labour rights standards. And again, there's not there that trade agreements, again AFTINET say that trade agreements should include commitments by governments not to reduce labour rights and to implement internationally agreed labour rights which are defined by the International Labour Organisation. These should be enforced by the state-to-state disputes process of the agreement. And of course, noting that these rights intersect with UN human rights obligations and include freedom of association, rights to collective bargaining, health and safety in the workplace, no forced labour, no child labour and no discrimination in the workplace. Again, this is what trade agreements should include. Rcep does not. Why should we be signing an agreement that does not include what are recognised as what should be in trade agreements? The third, of course, that I wanted to get to is the lack of human rights standards. And this then comes to I just am stunned, absolutely stunned, that we are signing a trade agreement with countries including Myanmar, with China, with the Philippines. And why? To be achieving no increase in our trade. Signing a trade agreement with Myanmar at the same time as countries around the world are trying to work out what is the most pressure that we can be putting on Myanmar, on the junta that took over Myanmar, the brutal attack on people, on democracy, on human rights, who have killed over 1,000 people. There are people who are fleeing the Myanmar military forces. We know that the pressure is on, not that Australia has done anything about it, to be applying sanctions. The EU, Canada, the US, the UK have all applied sanctions. We at least have said that we're not going to continue any military cooperation. We need to be having economic sanctions. All of this is necessary to try and do something about this brutal attack on democracy in Myanmar. That's what Australia should be doing in relation to Myanmar. But no, we are signing a trade agreement with them. Why on earth would we be signing a trade agreement with them? It can only be taken as us being complicit, as us giving tacit support to the Myanmar military takeover and the junta in Myanmar. That in itself should be a reason to say we are going to put this on hold. We're not signing a trade agreement with Myanmar as part of it. It is just something that is unacceptable for Australia to do. China. I mean, we've got a free trade agreement with China, which they are blatantly breaching. The bans on our goods going into China because they are unhappy with us, because we're speaking out about some of their human rights abuses and about their expansionism. So they've decided to block our imports into China, our exports into China. Again, why, given that behaviour by China at the moment, given that is so live, given that the Australia-Chinese relationship is at such a low ebb at the moment, there are so many other things that we should be doing with China to be working out how we improve that relationship. But just blatantly signing a trade agreement that doesn't require any of that negotiation is it's ridiculous. And thirdly, I mean, other countries, and essentially when hearing speeches today about this, essentially we're signing this trade agreement because ASEAN nations and the main nations that are involved, and we want to keep sweet with ASEAN, and it would be a snub to them if we didn't. We need to be working out how we work with ASEAN without supporting brutal, military, totalitarian governments, because frankly, otherwise maintaining nice, polite relationships with brutal totalitarian governments that are destroying the lives of their citizens, as we have heard so much of in this parliament over the years, but particularly for me in my role as the Foreign Affairs spokesperson over the last year, frankly, we should not be kowtowing to them and basically saying, OK, we'll sign trade agreements. Yes, we need to be working out how we work multilaterally, how we can be working together where we have got common interests, but signing free trade agreements that do not require anything from them in terms of human rights in particular, as well as labour rights, as well as environmental rights, is not the way to go. And so then fourthly, the lack of environmental rights standards. And the other three areas I've talked about are pretty amazing and astounding, but the lack of environmental rights standards in this, the Rcep trade negotiation are just gobsmacking. We are in a climate crisis. We are in a time in humanity, possibly this year, certainly this decade, in terms of the future of humanity on this planet, the climate crisis is the #1 thing that we need to be tackling. And yet we are signing a trade agreement that doesn't even have an environmental chapter in it, that doesn't say that have any constraints, it doesn't have any measures in it to require requiring governments to be taking climate seriously and for that to impact on our trade relationships. Of course, other countries in the world are very much linking climate and trade, and it's quite right that they should do that, not just on a moral reason that we should only be trading with countries that are tackling the climate crisis appropriately, given it's a shared issue for all of us, but it is an economic issue, and that's what the European Union, of course, are realising, that if they are taking action to be slashing their carbon pollution by more than 50% by 2030, why should other countries freeload on that? There are costs over the coming years of making the huge cuts in our carbon pollution. The benefits of doing that, of course, are immense, because it means that humanity will actually have a future. But there are costs, and so why shouldn't the European Union, that is taking those actions, actually say, well, if the other countries, if you're not taking those costs into account, if you are just letting polluters pollute for free, well then we are going to put some tariffs on you to account for that. And we had the Trade Minister just yesterday, our Trade Minister, noting that Australia is likely to be liable for tariffs, carbon tariffs, for goods that we are trying to export into the EU. And it is very appropriate that we should be. And what that means, instead of having a price on carbon here in Australia that we could be reaping the benefits of and having the revenue raised by that price on carbon going into supporting the transition to a zero-carbon economy here in Australia and supporting people who need to transition, of supporting programs for jobs, for workers who need to transition out of the mining of coal and gas and oil, instead of that revenue being able to be allocated to that, it's going to be revenue that's going off to the European Union so that they can use that revenue. Basically, these things are linked. We are in a climate crisis. There is action that needs to be taken. International mechanisms, multitudes of international mechanisms all around the world are being developed to work out how we work together as a world to be tackling climate. The COP26 conference in Glasgow that starts in 10 days' time is obviously one of those prime mechanisms to be getting countries to be upping the level of their national contributions to be slashing our carbon pollution. And that, while here we have a government that's doing nothing, that's going off to Glasgow basically with a completely empty basket. We're offering nothing in terms of an increase in our ambition in tackling the climate crisis. At the same time, we are signing a trade agreement that says zero about carbon, zero about climate. It is just unthinkable. And it's just showing that we have just got it completely upside down when it comes to how we think about what it means to be a good global citizen, what it means to be acting in the global interest, what it means to be acting in our national interest. And all of those three things are the same. We need to be putting human rights, labour rights, our extinction crisis, the huge pressures that the world's environments are under, our biodiversity under, and the huge pressures that the world is under because of climate, they need to be front and centre of everything we are doing, because they are existential crises that the world is under. Every global mechanism that we take part of, we should be saying, is this going to help or is this going to hinder action on tackling the climate crisis? There are so many things we could be doing to help. We could be going to Glasgow and saying, yes, Australia is going to play its part. We are going to slash our pollution, as the science says it should happen, by 75% by 2030 at least, and to zero carbon as quickly as possible thereafter. We could be doing that. We could be signing up to the Powering Past Coal Alliance, which has got 41 countries who are committing to be getting out of coal by 2030. We could be signing up to the Global Methane Alliance. We could be taking any number of actions internationally. But instead, what are we doing? We are signing a free trade agreement that basically is blind to all of these issues that the world is facing. The Australian Greens support fair trade. We support having good relationships with our neighbours, but we don't support the sorts of arrangements that are in the Rcep and absolutely should not be supported.